In this video, we're going to talk about while loops and do-while loops. Now, while loops and do-while loops are very closely related, but there's one big difference between them that we will talk about shortly. So a while loop looks like this. We use the keyword while, and then we check some condition. And we're checking to see if this condition is true or false. So while this condition is true, we run some code, and we keep looping. When the condition becomes false, we continue with our code. A do-while loop is very similar, but we start it with the keyword do. Then we have our code body, then we have the keyword while, and we check a condition. Once again, we're checking if this condition is true or false. So we keep looping while this condition is true. And we'll have a look at some examples of this in a minute. But the one big difference between this, and I can't stress this enough because this is very important, a while loop checks the condition before the code runs. That means if this condition is false, the code will never ever run. A do-while loop checks the condition after the code has run. That means this code always runs at least once. Because we check the condition at the end of the loop, if this condition is false, the code runs once, then it checks the condition, and if it's false, then it continues with code down here. So a do-while loop always runs at least once, whereas a while loop will only run if the condition is true. So let's have a look at some examples of this. So here we go. I've got my first variable here, an int called value1 that's equal to 10. Now I say while value1 is less than 10. Actually, let's change this. I'll use this for another example. Make this equal to 1 and make this equal to 1. So I've got an int called value1 that's equal to 1. And I say while value1 is less than 10, loop. So this is going to loop as long as value1 is less than 10. Now, one thing we have to be careful of is that this condition will become false at some point. If this condition is always going to be true, we will get into an endless loop. We saw in a for loop, we change our value while we are looping, and we do that in the for loop statement at the top. Whereas if we don't do this in a while loop, so you can see here, I'm incrementing value1 by 1 each loop. So if I was to neglect to do this, value1 would always be equal to 1. It would always be less than 10, so we would get in an endless loop. The loop would just keep looping and looping and looping until the program crashed. So make sure whatever condition you're using to check for your while loop will eventually evaluate to false, otherwise you won't break out of the loop. So now let's look at this second example of my do loop. I've got an int variable called value2. It's also equal to 1. So as we discussed, we use the keyword do. Then we have the code that's going to run. Then we check our condition. So I'm saying do this while value2 is less than 10. Once again, always got to make sure whatever condition I'm using, you can see I'm incrementing value2. We've got to always make sure that this will evaluate to false at some point. Otherwise, this loop will keep looping. So you can see here this I've started at 1. Because I increment it at every loop, I increment it by 1. Eventually, value2 will be greater than 10. So this will eventually evaluate to false and the loop will finish. So make sure that you increment your condition, or however you're going to check your while condition will eventually evaluate to false. We can run these and these should print out the same thing. Let's just run it and have a look. So I'm going to compile, create a new instance of topic 5 and run test while loops. Now we can see value 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Value 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in this current state, both of these do the same thing. But if I was to make this equal to 10 and this equal to 10, so in this case, value 1 equals 10. 10 is not less than 10, so this code will never run. But in this case, because we run our code before we check our condition, remember a do loop always runs at least once. Because 10 is not less than 10, so this is false, but we run this code one time before we evaluate the condition. So let's check this. I'm going to compile, create a new instance of topic 5, a new object, test while loops. So we can see, based upon this loop never ran. We don't have a printout giving us the value of value 1. But we do have a printout giving us the value of value 2. Because even though this condition was false, the loop ran at least once. Now, when would you use a while loop and a do loop, or where would you use them instead of a for loop? Well, most of the time you're going to be using for loops. But while loops are very useful when we're reading files and things like that. And we'll have a look at some examples of places that you would use a while loop in future videos. Just remember though, the main difference between these two, if you're going to use a while loop or a do while loop, if you always want your code to run at least once, you use a do loop. If you want to check the condition before you run the loop, you would use a while loop.